नमस्कार। कृपया आप सभी अपना स्थान ग्रहण कर लें और अपने मोबाइल फोन्स को साइलेंट पर रख लें। मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ कल्चर, साहित्य अकादमी और हिमाचल प्रदेश सरकार के भाषा संस्कृति विभाग की ओर से आयोजित इस 3 दिवसीय अंतर्राष्ट्रीय साहित्य उत्सव उन्मेष के आज आखिरी दिन में हम आप सभी का बहुत बहुत स्वागत करते हैं। ये उत्सव आजादी के महोत्सव They're talking. Sir, may I please request you to kindly take your seats? ये उत्सव आजादी के अमृत महोत्सव के तहत मनाया जा रहा है। पिछले 2 दिनों में और आज भी हम बहुत से राइटर्स, स्टोरी टेलर्स, थिंकर्स, ट्रांसलेटर्स से मिले और उसी कड़ी को आज आगे बढ़ाते हुए आज के दिन के पहले सत्र का प्रारंभ करते हैं। डिस्कशन ऑन वर्ल्ड क्लासिक्स एंड इंडियन रीडर्स। Over the centuries, well-written books have captured the imagination of readers all across the world. World classics in several languages have inspired many Indians to translate those literature works into their regional languages so that they can share it with their communities, with their fellow people. Without further ado, I would like to begin today's session and request the chair of today's session, Chinmay Guha ji. हम गुजारिश करेंगे चिन्मय गुहा जी से कृपया वो मंच पर आएं और इस सत्र की अध्यक्षता का भार संभालें। Chinmay Guha is a professor of English at the University of Calcutta and a distinguished French scholar. He has served as Vice Chancellor, Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata, and Director of Publications, Embassy of France, New Delhi. आपके निबंध संग्रह घूमरदार जो थेले के लिए आप साहित्य अकादमी पुरस्कार से सम्मानित हैं। उनके साथ मंच पर आमंत्रित करना चाहूंगी अनीता अग्निहोत्री जी को। क्या वो हमारे बीच हैं? अब हम गुजारिश करेंगे अश्विनी कुमार जी से कि कृपया वो मंच पर आएं। Ashwini Kumar is one of the prominent Indian poets writing in English. His major poetry volumes include My Grandfather's Imaginary Typewriter and Banaras and Other. Recently, a collection of his select poems titled Architecture of Alphabets has been published in Hungarian. वर्तमान में आप मुंबई स्थित टाटा इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ सोशल साइंसेज के स्कूल ऑफ डेवलपमेंट स्टडीज में प्रोफेसर और डीन के रूप में अपनी सेवाएं दे रहे हैं। Now I would like to request Krishna Manavalli to kindly join the panelists on stage. Krishna Manavalli is currently professor in the Department of English at the University of Mysore, Karnataka. Krishna is a literary critic and translator who works in both English and Kannada languages. साथ ही बुलाना चाहेंगे सायंतन दास गुप्ता जी को। क्या वो हमारे बीच हैं? नहीं। हम गुजारिश करेंगे शाफे कदवाई जी से कि वो कृपया मंच पर पधारें। Shafiq Advaiji is a bilingual scholar, literary critic, columnist, translator, and reviewer. He has authored 15 books in English and Urdu. आपको साहित्य अकादमी पुरस्कार सहित कई अन्य प्रतिष्ठित पुरस्कारों से सम्मानित किया गया है। और अब हम गुजारिश करेंगे अजय शर्मा जी से कि वो साहित्य अकादमी की ओर से सबका अभिनंदन करें, सम्मान करें। सबसे पहले अध्यक्षता कर रहे चिन्मय गुहा जी। शाफे किदवाई जी। अब हम सम्मानित कर रहे हैं अश्विनी कुमार जी को। कृष्णा मनवल्ली जी। आपसे अनुरोध है कि क्योंकि हम बहुत कम लोग यहाँ पर मौजूद हैं, आपस में बात ना करें और इन गुणी सज्जनों को सुने तो और आनंद ले पाएंगे। शुरुआत करते हैं आज के सत्र की और अनुरोध करते हैं चिन्मय गुहा जी से कि वो अपनी अध्यक्षता संभालें। धन्यवाद।
So thank you very much for being here on this rainy day. And I'm sure it was not easy for any of us. I walked halfway, bought an umbrella with the luggage, and with the fractured head and nose, it was not easy at all with fever. And I'm sure it was the same for many of you. And let's begin. I'm sure many people will come in after we start. The subject is world classic Indian readers. World classic and classics and Indian readers. And in my opinion, nothing is more important, more relevant than this at this point of time in history, in the moment of cultural neurosis, sociological neurosis, and cultural amnesia. Nothing could be more important than this desperate attempt to connect with the world. And if you look at the program, it is about a celebration of it's an international literature festival to celebrate 75 years of independence. That's very important. And I thought nobody mentioned it in any of the sessions that after 75 years, we are reflecting on what we have actually done or what we have failed to. It's a moment where we stop and ponder 75 years, what does it really mean to us? Have we arrived anywhere or are we moving in circles? And if you look at the topics, you will find that all the subjects were very well chosen, very important. I really wondered how important, relevant, and meaningful these topics are, including the multiple readings of short stories and poetry. And I have two friends from my state, Bengal, here, and many from all over the country. And I'm very happy to have with us a star-studded galaxy. Anita Ognihotri has not been able to come, one of the greatest Kathashilpis of Bengal, with 40 books. She has not been able to come because of health issues at home. And we have Ashwini Kumar, who's a very well-known poet who writes in English. The introduction was already given. My grandfather's imaginary typewriter, one of his latest volumes. And of course, he works as professor and dean of the School of Development Studies at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. We have Krishna Manavalli, who is a professor of English at University of Mysore, literary critic, translator, and has translated Chandrasekhar Kambar's novels and plays. So these are really social activists, literary activists, in a moment of, I would say, social neurosis and cultural amnesia, where we hardly remember our own father's name. And we have Sayantan Dasgupta, who is not yet here. My God, he's still on the way. professor of comparative literature at Jadavpur University and coordinator of translation of Indian literature. So very, very, I would say, well-chosen panel. And then we have Safi Kidwai, who is one of my favorite Indian intellectuals, because we got the Sahitya Academy in the same year in 2019. And Shafiq Kidwai, who is a literary critic, scholar, bilingual, scholar, columnist, translator, and reviewer, author of 15 books in English and Urdu, including his latest, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. He's, of course, from Aligarh Muslim University. We've read his columns and articles in The Hindu, The Frontline, The Hindustan Times, The Book Review, etc. And he's here, a razor-sharp man we badly need in this moment of crisis. A man who knows how to stand aloof and judge the situation we are. So today we are basically, I'm not going to talk too much. I have this bad habit of talking too much. Once I was presiding over a panel where there were people like Adur Gopal Krishnan and Girish Kasravali, and he spoke more than them. And Adur told me, this is why we don't want a professor as chairperson, because it's a habit with us. But one very important point we noted that no one said, except perhaps in the first session, that it is a reflection on 75 years of independence. Where are our coordinates? Do we need a kind of cultural inquiry? Because we are suffering. We are not doing what is called, what René Wille called cultural bookkeeping. We want to know how to re-legitimize the book. I'm quoting Hermann Hesse. To re-legitimize the book and ask this very important question in this age of social media, which has invaded our space in a bad way. Has the book maintained its dignity and authority? Has the book maintained its dignity and authority? And all of us, Ashwini, Krishna Manavali, and Shafiq Kidwai have read books from the outer world and tried to adjust, appropriate, and enrich ourselves. So maybe they will talk about their experience of how the world changed them outside world, because India changed. There's no doubt about it that this landlocked Indian literature, for the first time, had a breath of fresh air when, so-called Renaissance arrived. And do you know that much of Sanskrit literature was re-edited and annotated after and translated after we discovered Shakespeare? So there's a balance all the time. Introspection and window open to the world. And people like Bankim Chatterjee was reading Auguste Comte and John Stuart Mill and Rousseau. So the world was opening out, windows opening out. If you live in a house which is suffocating without windows, you will die. And if we become insular to what is going on, because half the poets, as I know them, don't know anything about Saint-Jean-Perse or René Char or Daniel Maria Rilke or even Goethe. If you don't read, how can you produce? And it'll be all bad to the paddy fields. You are thoughtless zombies producing meaningless, empty, insignificant, worthless discourse, which may get awards in this country, but which means nothing. There is a vibration. It is the 100 centenary of the wasteland. Can you imagine lines like, I can connect nothing with nothing? Lines like, what shall I do now? What shall I do? This is the question that Eliot asked in 1922. This is the question that Annuda Shankar Rai asked in 1950. That's the question Pascal asked in 1660. Qu'est-ce que je fais maintenant? What do I do? Ami ki korbo? So this is very important. The question is, today's world, the real Shakespeare has disappeared into Shakespeare's reputation. Tagore is a name. In most cases, I'm not talking about the enlightened people here. Most of you are different. But now there is invasion of the overpowering market. So it's a moment of crisis. And it's also a moment of epiphany. Can we find out a new interculturality? How did our readings change us? In my case, I was reading English literature, and even mediocre English writers like George Meredith and pre-Raphaelite writers make no sense now. But then I discovered the French. Then I thought that the vibrations, the resonances, I could assimilate and recreate, and not a kind of cosmetic, I would say, presentation, but a kind of inner, deeper, intenser discourse. That's what I tried to do in my own way. I thought for the first time since Buddhadeva Boshu, anyone try to at least look into the language, feel it, savor it. Akash theke nokkhotre jol pocche. It's raining waters from the stars. So how can we sort of change it? And that vibration came from the West, but it had to be internalized, like Ray did in the case of Renoir and Disica. He made it his own. So that is very important. So you borrow maybe there can be convergences, but there is also, as scholars here know, combats, the anxiety of influence. You have to combat, you resist, and try to recreate yourself. So cross-fertilization that happened all the time since, I think, the 19th century or earlier. And that was part of the alternative quest. But now Shantanu Dasgupta has arrived. No wonder he started before me. Professor of Jadavpur University Comparative Literature, Center for looks after Center for Translation of Indian Literatures, member of the Advisory Board of English Sahitya Academy, and one of his latest books is Celebrating the City, Kolkata in Indian Literature. So this mosaic, all of us are trying to comprehend this great country of 3,287,032 kilometers. Where do we stand? More than 1500 languages. Could we interact? Could we go beyond cultural interfaces and go deep into it? Because we all know that media formats are ephemeral. However much we are sort of attached to our mobile sets and our own versions of Wikipedia, this will not take us anywhere. So I really hope that it's going to open up new ways of looking at it. When we took from outside, say, Venugopal Chariyar, who had translated Merchant of Venice in Tamil in 1874, said, admitted, confessed that he was showing the Hindu Pandits the great difference between the verisimilitude of Shakespeare's plays and the unreality of Indian theater. So you see, we were transforming ourselves, and let us not forget that in Indian encounter with the West is an essential part of the history of Indian literary transformation in the 19th century. The English novel was influenced by Walter Scott. And so the change came, but where did it take us? So it's time to judge. And they will speak, will be in a hurry, because I have, like Shafiq Idwai, I have to rush to Chandigarh. Was Indian thought a counterpoint to Western thoughts? Or was it part of it? The borrowings, the thefts, the convergences, the combats, the resistances. How did we sort of face this? And did we answer this question? How the self can connect with the other? That is, I think, the crux of the matter. Could we do it, or were we stranded in between? Or is it possible to assimilate? Because Kafka's dark night of the soul is not ours. It's another world. Ours is Yuthabaddhata. It's community life. If we burn buses and trams, we do it together. No, we don't really perhaps connect with Eliot's, "Oh Lord, thou pluckest me out, thou pluckest me out, burning, 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 burning," 100 years ago. Can we reach that level? I don't know. Readings are important, various kinds of reception. So over to this great panel, more erudite than me, and of course many of you are too. I'm leaving them I begin with Shafiq Idwai, my friend from Aligarh Muslim University, a true intellectual that we need at this moment of neurosis.
Thank you very much, Chinmay, for your extreme kind words. We have very eminent panelists. Before we start, at the outset, Chinmay made a point. I just quote Javed Akhtar, and he made a very pertinent point when he was in Aligarh. जो प्रोफेसर देर तक बोलते हैं उसके बारे में उन्होंने एक जोक सुनाया था. I just want to repeat because I believe in laconic brevity. So I won't take more than 10 minutes. I would be making my point. तो जावेद साहब ने कहा एक दफा अलीगढ़ आए, ख्वाजा अहमद अब्बास पे एक सेमिनार था, तो उन्होंने तकरीर की और एक उर्दू के स्कॉलर थे, वो आ गए, वो बोल रहे थे, उन्होंने he took 55 minutes. उसको बार बार वो पर्चा भेज रहे थे कि इनको रोकिए, और गालिब का एक मिसरा भी उन्होंने मुझे लिख के भेजा, करता कोई बंदे गुस्ताख का मुंह बंद. लेकिन वो बंदे गुस्ताख जो थे माने नहीं, बोलते रहे 55 मिनट वो बोले. उसके बाद जावेद साहब गए बोलने, तो उन्होंने एक बात कही और बात करके ये कहा, उन्होंने कहा एक लतीफ़ा सुनाया, लतीफ़ा था, उन्होंने कहा कि सुकरात को जाहिर है सबको हम लोग पता है कि उनको जहर दिया गया. तो उन्होंने कहा कि जब उसका जहर दे दिया गया तो उसके बाद एक जहाँ के वो रहने वाले थे वहाँ उनके पास फेस्टिवल होता रहा और बुक एग्जीबिशंस भी होती थी, उनकी राइटिंग्स भी लोग पढ़ते थे और उस पर एग्जाम वो भी होता था. बच्चों के लिए डिबेट कॉम्पिटिशन्स और ऐसे राइटिंग कॉम्पिटिशन्स भी होते थे. तो एक बच्ची ने, 5 साल की बच्ची थी, 6 साल की, उसने 6th स्टैंडर्ड में पढ़ती थी, उसने एक पेज का उस पर नोट लिखा, सुकरात पे लिखा कि बहुत अच्छे ये बड़े विद्वान थे, बड़े स्कॉलर थे और उनको बहुत कंट्री का कंसर्न था, लेकिन बहुत बड़ी बड़ी तकरीरें, बहुत लंबी लंबी तकरीरें करते थे, इसलिए पब्लिक ने उनको जहर दे दिया. That was the point. So I will begin with that. The discussion, Chinmay started very well and he made very pertinent point regarding our readings, world classics and Indian readers. So first point I just want to make is, I just tell that I won't be speaking more than 10 minutes. So we are living in a world where digital world is there, and digital world means permanence, and book has lost its relevance, the people say. But Umberto Eco once, some people asked him, his last interview asked about the future of book. He said that in human history, 3 things are there. They cannot be fully subverted or appended. These 3 things he just mentioned, that first was wheel, second one was spoon, and the third one is a book. Spoon has got 2 meanings. Spoon is just something we can take out and nothing can replace a spoon, and a spoon has got some metaphorical meaning. Chamcha and chammach is always there. So he said the book is like that. Maybe e-book, maybe any book is there, but it cannot be fully subverted. It can be replaced by another shape, but it is there. So as far as the classic discussion on world classics and Indian readers are concerned, so the point is we live in a factory world. I would say that is a post-truth period where what is the relevance of classical books and classic books, what they are. I will try to define it. You see, people always, nowadays we always think of where the book is very thick, very voluminous, and multiple characters are there. If you just refer to Russian great writers, there are so many things are there. So we live in a world where where writing is specific, unornamented, and full of, and we don't like rhetorical flourish. Though Mr. Ashwani, a very good poet, is there, he believes in a rhetorical flourish all the time. Even in daily speech, he does it. So this apart. So before that, now what is how to go about it? So there was, I just read through a book in book review in New Yorker. He talked about there are several go to great books. The point I just want to make is book cannot be canonized. You see, the books are universal. You say there's a you see there's a colonial master. They said these are the classical books, and they are not. So book, I think they express their shared universal expressions. So they cannot be canonized, but we do it. So before that, now we find that if we read, say, Virgil, Homer, and whatever you can say, Paradise Lost, or Rubaiyat Umar Khayyam, these are some classical readings. Before that, they say there is a way. They say go to great books. For that, they refer to the name of Orwell and Passage to India, and so many books. Jane Austen, their books are there. So they are, if you read these books, then they will pave the way for reading great books. They are full of human expressions and human predicament and elemental human solitude. They are all discussed. When you read classics, what the classic book is. Once Auditorium defined classic books in a very interesting manner. He says classic book is that classic books are those that continue to say what they have to say. It's not that one time you read it and the message is over. They continue to initiate a dialogue with you. So it becomes part of your day-to-day experience. So that's why very passive kind of entertainment can become very mental nourishment. It provides mental nourishment, though it is a passive. If you read a book, it is a passive, I think, expression or passive act of entertainment. So no other can do it. So this is the way. So what the point I was just making is, the people nowadays, I'm afraid not many people, they read classical books or classics. Say talk about the War and Peace, Moby Dick, and there are so many thick books. There are so many characters with multiple names. So it's very difficult to retain them. So Ulysses is there. There's a one book is annotated Ulysses. Annotated Ulysses is there. There are so many glossaries there, and apart from that, there's a full-length introduction running into, say, 13 pages. That gives you something to grasp it in a better manner. So in India, in Indian readers, there's a very famous Urdu poet, Mr. Srivastava is there. He worked on Premchand's story. So Premchand and so many Hindi writers, they were greatly, I would be talking to Urdu and Hindi writers. This is the area I know a bit. So in Hindi and Urdu, Tolstoy influenced much. And in Hindi, Rubaiyat Umar Khayyam, it was translated by the Bachchan. And so many writers, they just took up Hafiz and Rumi. Maulana Rumi, they translated, there were the classical books in Persian, and Persian, there is a Rubaiyat Umar Khayyam that was translated by Fazlal, then it was rendered into Urdu. Then Hindi poetry was influenced greatly. Indian readers, they like Rubaiyat Umar Khayyam. And Rajendra Singh Bedi and Premchand and so many writers, Urdu and Hindi writers, even Qurratuddin Haider, they were greatly influenced by the classical books, especially the classical writers. I would say Tolstoy, they were greatly influenced. So what we read in classics, that are through translation, be it Mahabharata, maybe Vedas, they are all translated books. So translation is also equally important in reading classical books. So even nowadays, what the point I was just making is that book cannot be canonized. If it is canonized, and we find it very difficult, say a book written, say 1,000 years ago, even in 19th century, 20th century books, so their situation is entirely different. So the book written before 1920 is very difficult to understand right now, because we read books in a certain circumstances, certain social circumstances and literary traditions. Our traditions are somewhat different. So though the classic, they just talk about, they just zero in on human solitude, human suffering, and that's made you aware of what it is. So the point I was just making is, as far as the classics are concerned, be it Alf Laila, we say it is Alif Laila, but it is Alf Laila. So it was rendered into English, then it was rendered into Urdu and Hindi. So they are all influenced by great writings, especially the Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky, and especially the Russian writing Pushkin. They were translated extensively in Hindi and Urdu. So all the classical books, they have a bearing on our cultural consciousness. Indian readers, they have this kind of thing. You see what classical book is all about. In Beckett's play, one character says, as far as the amount of tears and amount of happiness is concerned, is a fixed. Nobody could, one person is just is happy at one place and is weeping at the other place. So this is a fixed amount of, you can say, the happiness you have and tears you have, they're all fixed. But a classic book tells you whatever is there, whatever the human suffering is there, every tear is yours. दुनिया में जो कुछ जिसकी भी आंख से जो बह रहा है वो खुद आपकी अपनी आंख का आंसू है. This is what classic literature tells us. So that's why, as far as the Indian consciousness is concerned, we owe much to great writings of especially the Britishers. Nowadays there are some Indian books are included, but for the last, no Indian books, no Chinese books, no Latin American books were classified, were dubbed as classics. Now they are coming up. But so it is a colonial hangover, we think. But so that's why we still believe in the canonization of book, which is not true. So for me, as far as the word classic is concerned, I would just again repeat Italio's expression that these are the books, they continue to have a living dialogue with you, no matter in which country you live in, and it is a human suffering that tells you. Herman Hesse, Chinmay Guha just referred to in his book, writing in his very famous book, that was Siddhartha. One character says, I have three things: I can wait, I can fast, and I can wait, I can fast, and I can think. These are the three things. It's very difficult to wait or to think and to write. So these are the, if you read a classical book, then these three qualities you can cultivate in yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think it was so enlightening. As I told you, that fundamentalism of any kind has no way out, offers us no way out. We have to open up, and Professor Shafiq Idwai spoke about this cross-fertilization across the barriers. And he mentioned Siddhartha, which was written 100 years ago, exactly like the wasteland in Ulysses, and the foundation of Vishwabharati, once again, the world in a nest. And very interesting coincidences on the 75th year of independence. And what is important is this cross-fertilization goes on because he spoke about this. So vibrations, resonances, 100 years after the books were written. As Umberto Eco wrote in a book, this is not the end of the book. The quest goes on. And what he said is so relevant today. And now I'm passing on to Ashwini Kumar, one of the, not only a handsome man, but also a very important poet. And Ashwini would speak about his own experience. Huh?
Friends, delighted to be part of this very significant moment in the cultural, literary, and political history of the country, Sahitya Academy celebrating 75th year of our independence. The moment is for introspection and reflection, and also looking at the future we are heading into. And I'm so, blessed in the sense that, Professor Chinmay Guha is moderating, anchoring, and perhaps, the way he has curated, our arrival and perhaps departure too, in a more poetic way, departure in multiple ways. And my friends are here. I'm indebted to all of you for coming here and celebrating together this very important and momentous moment in our history, and also the title World Classic and Indian Readers. So what I'm going to do first, as I always do, a little bit, I live in poetry. I live in poetry. It's no disclosure, It's very apparent from the way I have lived throughout my life as a poet. So let me just dedicate a few words to my mentor and to my Ustad Husnan Khan Sahib, transcreating Amir Khusro Sahib. And this is the way I'm relating, from where I'm coming and how I'm reflecting in world classic, from my own perspective, native perspective. So this is from Amir Khusro Sahib. I made my image, and from my Ustad Hasnan Khan Sahib, Raja Mian Sahib, I made my image in the color of love. I made my image in the color of love, played holy in the courtyard with Hazrat Khwaja. Played holy in the courtyard with Hazrat Khwaja. Friends, I'm not ashamed of the world, nor of my poetry. Thank you. So this is today, I was thinking I won't take much time, perhaps, only 8 minutes or 9 minutes. And then what I'm going to do is a little more reflective, introspective. I work around memories. So the title of my short presentation, and this is the way I relate to prose. This is the way I relate to fiction. And this is also how many of us, writers in India work in different places. So the title of my presentation is Remembering World Classic, Wandering Across Languages and Geographies. I'm a creature of scattered circumstances, alien languages and memories. In my unofficial fictional birthplace, in the Saranda forest at the tri-junction of Orissa, Bengal and Bihar, the royal family, lecherous priest and brawling miners hunted down so-called bandits, man-eaters, and mythical shape-shifting snakes to propitiate the river Suvarna Rekha for digging gold flakes. The tradition of blood sacrifice still continues in the name of flushing out subaltern rebels in this red ash-colored mining camp town, a surreal gulag of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. As far as I remember, my family landed in the Saranda forest because of my father's transferable job in the local police bureaucracy. We traveled frequently. From a small town to smaller towns and often lived in cheap asbestos houses like the nomadic Machiaganus in Amazon Basin jungle. We believed that we stopped moving, disaster would befall us. So friends, we continued our shape-shifting journey across parrot-grained illusory geographies of languages and literature, and especially with the world classics. Sounds strange, but I was deprived of a primordial mother language in the conventional sense. For my mother spoke Magahi, a Bihari dialect, and occasionally wrote in now extinct Kathi script. In contrast, my father was a highbrow, fluent with Hindi and other languages, and he gradually acquired a smattering of English and slowly became more cosmopolitan in his taste, literary, and also temperaments. We did not know anything Roman classic or English classic as my friends who were teaching these subjects know. Forget about Roman classics or Egyptian antiquity or Harappan myths. We did not even know about the existence of United States of America. Columbus was a lazy donkey in the backyard family barn. If my father smelt anything, he loved hydrogen peroxide, Havana cigars, and his obsession for reading classic literature. When not chasing river pirates, he would often read translation of Tolstoy, Lorca, Ibn Battuta, stories of Mullah Nasruddin, Agatha Christie, and also popular crime thrillers of James Headley Chase. You can find many versions even in Gujarati Javeri Bhai. Given the sway of Nehruvian socialism and the fantasy about a new dream world, he was also intoxicated with Russian books published in local language by Progress Publications, which had beautiful drawings and interesting stories. Not surprisingly, Gorky's mother, Tolstoy Anna Karenina, War and Peace, Dostoevsky's brother Karamazov, Solzhenitsyn, Boris Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago, and Ivan Turgenev's father and sons. Believe me, trust me, poets are not trusted. Believe me, for years, I could not understand the meaning of the nihilism until I landed on the campus of Delhi University. And once I woke up in the middle of night at my Jubilee Hall, in famous Jubilee Hall, hostel room, and found myself in the company of Bazarov. You remember Bazarov from Father and Sons. And I found Bazarov, the giraffe in black hangman trousers. I screamed out of fear. People say, not my friends say, one of whom is here and a poet celebrated. People say that my roommates reported me to the guards in khaki shorts. They came to Jubilee Hall, handcuffed me, and banished me to Botany Way on the campus of Oklahoma University in the capital of tornadoes. I never realized, Chinmay, that reading classic could be so cruel and knowing alien languages such beautiful punishment. Reverting back to my father's obsession with world classic, I must tell friends that he tried unsuccessfully to publish his motorcycle diary, written almost in the mode of Che Guevara, in the locally popular journal, The Red Front, and other stories. My elder siblings say he stopped writing after suffering memory loss from my poem, for his first bride from a poor widow. Alzheimer came to him sheepishly like extramarital affairs, offering instant promise to him to rejuvenate his rotten arteries of lost love, from my book, My Grandfather Said. No wonder you won't believe I loved playing with the rubber toys of Lenin, Stalin, and Che Guevara in my adolescent years. Perhaps, I suspect, when I landed in Barron, Oklahoma, of Derek Walcott from my doctoral study, I experienced Fernando Pessoa and his many heteronyms colluding and colliding with each other at the hallucinatory cliff of my fantasies about my own many selves. I suffered from the cold, hemorrhaging guilt as I practiced human sacrifice in a foreign language. To overcome the lack of a primordial language of my skin, my color, my dreams, and my memory, I would often hide into the tornado shelter on the campus, quote, with the long bearded Darwin and his progenies, and read books that my father had recommended. And believe me again, if you can't trust me, just believe me. When I came back home, I went around searching for Fernando Pessoa's work translated in Hindi, Atma Ki. Just put it. This is like, Atma Ki Khoj. On a lighter note now, coming back from more serious to a lighter note, I don't know how many of you even heard about a ghost town, Derry on Soon. Recently, I wrote something about this ghost town. At the railway station I would go to, and then buy translation of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels and Herman Melville's Moby Dick and Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. If my memories have made you wonder about the classics, world classics or the Western classics, let me give you a formal sense of what it means in the literary world. A classic is an old author canonized by admiration sufficient, an authority in his particular style. The word classic was first used in this sense by the Romans, if I'm not wrong. The idea of a classic implies something that has continuous and consistency, and which produces unity, tradition, fashion, and transmits and endures over time, like our memory. Italian writer Italo Calvino once wrote, "The classics are books that exert a peculiar influence, and they conceal themselves in the folds of memory, camouflaging themselves as the collective or individual unconsciousness." Reflecting on what he considered his much preferred definition of a classic, French literary critic Saint-Beuve writes that a writer of a classic is an author who has enriched the human mind, increased its treasure, and caused it to advance a step, who has discovered some moral and not equivocal truth or revealed some eternal passion in that heart where all seemed known and discovered. I confess when I read the world classic like 1984, I had no idea as a young boy about the George Orwell's bleak dystopian world. A story that remains eternally fresh and contemporary, and whose terms such as Big Brother, Doublethink, and Newspeak have become part of everyday currency. 94, has been translated into more than 65 languages. Back to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, during pandemic, I worked on Gulag and created some works around that in my poetic way, who brought global attention to the evils of the Soviet systems, Gulag systems, wrote, the only substitute for an experience we ourselves have ever lived through is art and literature. Therefore, the great literatures become the living memory of a nation. So like we cling to our friends, like long poems, I write long poems, boring poems, we stay with the memorable world classic. I don't believe in a laundry list of world classics or any classics for that matter, because all writings are rambling substitute, body images, splintering and mirroring in our desires. So let me conclude on a personal note. Often while reading world classic like Gulag or the Westland, I return to my imaginary city, Demoria, a city with terracotta towers, bronze statues of all the gods, Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Buddhists, Parsis, Sikhs, Nagas, and others, and where cockfights in brothels degenerate into the bloody brawls over Kublai Khan's original birthplace. Let my friends allow me to close my eyes with red paprika and torn pages of memories about the world classic. Reading world classics looks like a hoax to camouflage dystopian fantasies of our tyrannical times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashwini. Excellent, I thought. Coming from a poet who is in the quest of a new language. And two of my favorite poets are living now. I thank them. Now, what is important in Ashwini's presentation was his reception of the vibrations. And that's very important. The book, said André Gide, does not create anything. Le livre ne crée rien. Il éveille. It doesn't create anything. It awakens from the slumber. When he read 1984 or other classics, Amir Khusru awakened him after that. It's what reading does. So with all other elements, which Sayantan comparatists would know, there are also other things, politics, and colonialism and the power, etc. But beyond that, there is something else. As he said, your tears are my tears. Huh? Somebody was watching Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay's Aparajito, The Unvanquished in America, an old lady, filmed by Satyajit Ray, said that it is my story, my tension with my child who left me. The same story, it's my story. So this kind of assimilation is important. And can it always happen? And let us see what Krishna Manavali has to say. She translates both ways from English to Kannada, has translated professor of English at Mysore University, and she has translated Chandrasekhar Kambar. Thank you, Dilip ji. Okay. So, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm a translator, and naturally, I'd like to begin talking about this issue. After all, this is an issue which is also at the heart of this world classics discourse. So let me kind of bring up some ideas and then throw around some thoughts of mine. It's not going to be a very coherent kind of a presentation. This is going to be more of a discussion. So I'm just going to throw around a few ideas that I've been thinking about for some time now on this issue of world classics. And I relate to this as a translator, basically. and also, of course, as a reader of world classics. Now, without sounding too academic, I'd like to bring up the names of two people. David Danbush, when he's talking about what is world literature, he discusses this idea of the interpretative communities. How are these communities formed? How are these communities of world literature readers formed? This is something that we have to think of right at the beginning when we think of who is reading these world classics. And when we are talking about Indian readers and then the world classic, who are these Indian readers that we are thinking of? And then today we are not only thinking of books and literary translations and then the academic discourses around them, but also the mode of circulation, the book market, and what's happening with the manner in which these world classics are being disseminated today. The third question that becomes important here is, do we use the same mode of reading when we read world classics that we use when we read works from our own languages and our own native contexts? This is another very interesting idea that we need to think about today. As Valerie Hanichuk very interestingly points out, this process of reading world classics is not just of reading texts which are translated, texts that travel across time and space, all about universality, timelessness, spaces which seem to proliferate across time and across geographical regions. I don't think it's just that, but there's also this whole notion of translated readers. How do we step into these world contexts? How do we step into these new contexts and become new kind of readers when we approach these world classics? That is something that we need to think of. And the moment we start thinking of that, what comes to my mind is definitely the idea or the concept of multiplicity. Multiplicity and plurality of contexts and perspectives that shape our reading of these classics necessitate a different mode, perhaps a very conscious and an open mode of reading, and also a willingness to change in very unexpected ways when we step into texts which are perhaps coming from global contexts. So minding my piece, I would say plurality, plenitude on the one hand, perspectives and politics, the four Ps, minding my four Ps. The Qs will come later, I think. In any case, I'd like to begin with two cases, very individual cases of two very important personalities of this country and the manner in which they relate to the world classics and how that opens up a whole world of thought on the issue of reading world classics, Indian readers reading world classics over generations. Now, these two important personalities who talk about the manner in which they're related to the world classics, I think make us think of how generations of Indian readers have accessed these world classics and what exactly the world classics meant to them. And they talk about the readings that they did and the manner in which these readings changed them. And one of them is the very, very important and internationally acclaimed musician, stalwart, Sarod player, Pandit Rajiv Taranji. Here is what he talks about, the manner in which he relates to world classics, or the manner in which he related to world classics as a child and how he was brought up in this global world context and what it does to him in terms of shaping his sensibility. And his father, Pandit Taranat, was somebody who was like a typical Renaissance figure who lived through the independence, very, very idealistic independence ferment. And then those were the times of euphoria. Those were the times of excitement. Those were the times when we were opening up to the world outside. So here is what he talks about in the manner in which he read world classics as a child. His mother, too, was an orator and a very, very important activist who worked on social causes in those times. And they're coming together is something which shapes the sensibility of the child. And here is this very, very beautiful piece where he talks about his music and himself. Music and I. I was born into a curious circumstance, curious and progressively important through a lifetime, because in many ways it lacked the many of the supports that a conventional framework offers. My parents were lovely people and each walked tall on the planet. In a great and a right act of recognition, they came together in what was received in those times as a radical union. They married, and since this was a radical marriage where they rejected the rituals, they, on the other hand, did not want to marry with the consent of the colonial government. So they came together in the presence of a whole lot of friends. And this was at that time a very radical kind of a marriage, by which I mean that their act immediately made them either scandalous or heroic. And so I was born into a glare and was brought up in the conscious structures of acculturation. Intense idealists that they were, they fed me with all the ingredients of the Renaissance culture of their time. Languages and arts and music were poured into me. I clearly remember the diet of reading I had. Vivekananda, Gandhi, and Nehru, English classics, some Sanskrit, Alasingacharya's Vachana Bharata, and Ramayana, and so on. I did not have a grandmother giving me the shade of illiterate tales. I did not have the pleasure of fumbling with a dialect which I could call my own. I knew the glory of whatever that India was. I didn't know the ghost behind the tree or the story of the local temple. To be told I was an Indian and a world citizen, both specifically and generally, was a bit of a stress. I hankered for those delicious substructures of belonging. In time, I simply had to find what I could not get in the given. I had to find out what it meant to be truly native, not the comfort of a childhood village or the comfort of a homogeneous joint family, but native in the idea and glare that a constant notion of India had become to me. That is, India was the smallest unit that I could imagine as belonging to. I groped among languages, and the groping only made me a good mimic. I was consciously looking for that medium which would create and contain all that my India was, and that turned out to be music. My affair with literature was beautiful and probably gave cherished moments of delicacy and insight, but it left me inchoate and drawn among conflicting perceptions. So here are some one of those generations of the early 20th century whose relationship to world classics is something that comes naturally because of the ferment, the cultural ferment around. And then he moves away from this kind of global context to find something that is very, very native, something that he calls the substructures of belonging. And on the other hand, you see a very different trajectory of relating to the world classics in another important literary figure, and that is, of course, Dr. Chandrasekhar Kambar, perhaps the finest myth maker of our times and a very, very stalwart writer, Kannada writer, and internationally known dramatist and playwright, dramatist and poet. Okay, here is what he is talking about in terms of the manner in which he accessed the world classics and the manner in which the global world opens up to him from the small place he grew up in. The little folk place, this is Kambar, the little folk place where I was born and grew up in has molded my thinking through life. Its rich myths, the stories that my people told, the close-knit structures of life lived here. These were what gave me a nearness to place. I found a sense of rootedness, a feeling of belonging. This place became the microcosmic Shivapura of my writing. As my dear friend, the well-known critic of the 60s and the brilliant Sarod maestro, Dr. Rajiv Taranath points out, quote unquote, place is at the core of my writing. I strongly identify with my place. I draw upon its mythopoeic imagination. My vision of Indianness is also tied to this place. This is not because my Shivapura is shut off from the changes in the world outside. it knows of and is affected by the larger national as well as global forces. Dr. Chandrasekhar Kambar talks about how he, on the one hand, was inspired by the folk and the myth traditions of North Karnataka, but at the same time, he responds keenly to the contemporary national and global context of our existence. As Rajiv Taranath points out in his brilliant translation of Kambar's path-breaking play, Jokumaraswamy, quote, in our country, the mythical episteme is still valid, natural, and real. To say this is to point out the core of Kambar's importance to literature, end quote. Taranath introduced Kambar to the writings of the English literary giants like D.H. Lawrence, T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, and others, while Kambar drew a new path to his writing, and what is more, to the whole trajectory of Navya writing in Kannada. He did recognize the genius of English poets like Yeats. He often talks about how this Celtic poet's idea of the spiritus mundi, a storehouse of images in the mind of the poet, has haunted him. So this is what seems to be a primary kind of an influence on him, and the manner in which the modernists, Eliot or Yeats, and then their engagement with the myth seems to influence Kambar is again a very interesting example of how a very important writer and reader, of course, at the beginning, moves towards the world classics from the native roots. So these two different trajectories are what I seem to find fascinating in talking about how we access those world classics. And then there are a couple of important things I'd like to talk about at this point, and my own experience of kind of toddling among my grandfather's library and finding a range of books starting from the 19th century English writers to then Ingersoll, and then actually a whole lot of thinkers like Russell and others. I would like to talk about how in the contemporary context, we also need to move away from the literary and perhaps also address the adaptations in the social media, adaptations in the different cultural media, and then talk about the digital environments in which we are talking about the world classics today. I think the other things we can bring up in our discussion, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Malavalli. Extremely thoughtful, perceptive, and extremely enriching for us, thought-provoking, like the other earlier speeches of Shafiq Kidwai and Ashwini. Now we have a comparatist speaking, and this is Shayantan Dasgupta, who is, as I said, professor of comparative literature, which was the Department of Comparative Literature in Jadavpur University was established in 1956, 51 years after Rabindranath Tagore spoke about Vishwa Sahitya for the first time in this part of the world. Yeah, and that was in 1905. So 51 years later, it was at Jadavpur University that this attempt to compare the complexities and the cobwebs was made. And here is Shayantan.
जिससे पहले वो प्रारंभ करें, हम अजय शर्मा जी से अनुरोध करेंगे, कृपया उनको सम्मानित करें.
Good morning. I think Professor Kidwai has already started by giving us various scholarly definitions of the word classic. Yes. Is that okay? Am I audible? Yes. So I think Professor Kidwai had started off the session by giving various scholarly definitions of the word classic. And I was thinking of this question of what is a classic and what makes a classic a classic. I'd like to share with you one of the answers that came back to me when I asked my students at Jadavpur, what is a classic and what makes a classic a classic? One of the answers I got was, well, A classic is a classic because it is a classic and because everyone else says it is a classic. Okay. That may be rather trite an answer, but I think that gives us something to think about. A classic becomes a classic because people read it. People read it across languages, across countries. They like it, they revere it, and so on and so forth, which means the idea of the formation of world classics is organically tied up with translation. World classics reach newer spaces because of translators like Constance Garnett, Anthea Bell, Derek Hockridge, Gregory Rabassa, and so on and so forth. Without them, perhaps the idea of world classics, the idea of world literature, Damrosh was mentioned, Krishnaji had mentioned, would not have been possible at all. The idea of world literature, of course, goes back all the way to Rabindranath. Yes, Vishwa Sahitya Chinmoyda mentioned that. Way back to Goethe, Welt Literatur. In the Indian context, perhaps a systematic study of world literature institutionally started with the establishment of comparative literature as a discipline in India in 1956, which was mentioned again. I'm mentioning this because the scholar I'm going to talk about was someone who was associated with comparative literature for many, many decades. I'm talking about Manubendra Bandyopadhyay, a translator who taught comparative literature for many decades at Jadavpur. And again, I think it's in the fitness of things that Chinmoyda is coordinating this session, because Chinmoyda was collaborator for several of Professor Bandyopadhyay's translation activities. At least one of his books actually mentions Professor Guho in the introduction itself. Translation, as we all know, is a political act, and translation and colonialism have had a very ambiguous, difficult relationship. One of the things that happened because of colonialism was our gaze in the colony tended to be fixated on the literature, language, culture of the colonizing center. So English, more often than not, was the source language or the target language as far as our translation activities were concerned. This may be taken to be one form of Anglocentrism, which affects itself in our translational practices. And this is something that some translators consciously have tried to break out of. Manubendra Bandyopadhyay is one such translator. His politics of translation was clearly embedded in his choice of the texts he opted to deal with. He was, in a way, trying to create an archive of a new set of classics, classics that were not available to the Bangla-speaking readership earlier. A trenchant critic of Eurocentrism and colonial hangover, Bandyopadhyay was trying to create this alternative archive for Indian readers. That is why he concentrated so extensively on translating third world literature. Perhaps there was a conviction that by exposing Indian readers to the literary produce of other previously colonized countries, one could build a constructive South-South solidarity. Perhaps when the young Indian reader read stories from countries like Cameroon, Egypt, China, Mexico, Nicaragua, and the Caribbean, they would realize how similar the values and cultures of these countries were. And perhaps that would be one way of weaning ourselves off from the existing colonial hangover. This was perhaps the idea with which Bandyopadhyay started the annual publication called Horbola, which was to feature stories, poems, folk tales, and plays for young adults from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and parts of Europe, which we were not yet exposed to, Eastern Europe, for instance. The publication folded up after a couple of issues, but it was brought out, selections were brought out in the form of a book in 1998. There seems to be a clear post-colonial charge in the very way this volume is conceived. And even a cursory glance at the contents will perhaps show that this was an endeavor ahead of its times. Manubendra Bandyopadhyay was particularly attentive to translating into Bangla literatures from languages and countries which were not available to Bangla readers at that point of time. And one also notes the diversity of genres and texts that he deals with. On the one hand, He took up Pablo Neruda's operatic text, which he translated as Joaquin Murrieta's Mohima o Mrittu in Bangla. At the same time, Bandyopadhyay was instrumental in introducing novels from other third world countries into Bangla. There was, for instance, Alejo Carpentierer Rochona Samogro, which was published in 1991, which brought into Bangla for the first time some of the most important short stories and novels written by the Cuban writer Alejo Carpentier. This was particularly important because Alejo Carpentier was the person who introduced this term, Lo Real Maravilloso, which was mistranslated into English as magical realism. So the importance of these works was a different kind of world literature was becoming available to the Bangla reader. There was a world literature, there were world classics outside of England, outside of Europe. This is something that he was probably trying consciously to establish and propagate. Along with fiction and opera, poetry too claimed Bandyopadhyay's attention. And he translated a substantial corpus of poetry from Latin America. Perhaps the most ambitious of his works in this direction was Ei Shopno Ei Gontobbo, Latin American Bidrohi Kobita, revolutionary poetry from Latin America. This carried poetry from countries such as Argentina, El Salvador, Cuba, Guatemala, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. So it's a very large swathe of space that he is introducing to the Bangla readership. Apart from this, there were Miroslav Holub from what was then Czechoslovakia, Vašku Popa from what was then Yugoslavia, Szymborska and Herbert from Poland. All of these poems were now becoming available as part of world literature for the Bengali reader. And finally, one cannot but talk about Manobendra Bandyopadhyay's role in popularizing Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his works as world classics to the Bangla-speaking reader. His translations of Garcia Marquez's novel, Cornel Kekeu Chithi Lekhena in Bangla, and Shorola Erendira, Innocent Erendira in Bangla, helped to introduce the magical realist world of Garcia Marquez to Bengal. And on most occasions, these translations were accompanied by prefatory comments and longer afterwards, which helped readers to contextualize these foreign literary products. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the kind of translation activity which people like scholars like Manobendra Bandyopadhyay had undertaken had a particular politics embedded within them. And what this kind of activity actually did was to open up an idea of world literature, an idea, a repository of world classics, which was perhaps new to the Bangla reader. So that resulted in expanding the idea of world literature and world classics for the Bangla-speaking reader. I'll let that be because I'm almost out of time. Thank you very much.
So thank you for attending this session, all of you and the panelists. All of them were very thought-provoking, perceptive, and provided us with food for thought in this important year, as I said, of 75th year of independence. As I said, in a world of cultural amnesia, in this huge country of 3,287,000 square kilometers, we're desperately trying to create a new discourse. Have we been able to do it? They all spoke, Ashwani Kumar and Dr. Manavali and Dr. Kidwai and Shanto Jayantan Dasgupta, they all spoke about cross-fertilization, how it enlightened us. For example, Professor Manobendra Bandyopadhyay spoke about Marquez before he won the Nobel Prize. And I remember that Orun Mitru, a poet who translated a lot of French poetry into English, and Voltaire's Candide also, he told me he was reading the French translation of the original Spanish before it was translated into English by Gregory Rabassa. So translation is very important. And I told you that the moot point is, did the reception to the classics, Western classics, basically Shakespeare and the Romantics, and then later on these writers, Eliot and all, Dickens, etc., and then up to Marquez and writers from all over the world, as Ashwini mentioned, he is deeply perceptive and receptive to Latin American literature, Western to Spanish literature. Could it really result? Did it really result in a kind of emergence of an alternative paradigm? We have Dr. Ram Kumar Mukhopadhyay, who is trying to write differently. But what is important is, therefore, this experience of a difference. It was important for us to wake us from slumber. When you read Shakespeare, we realize that plays are written this way, and that's why I told you that as early as in the mid-19th century, the Tamil translator said, I wanted to translate it to show that this representation is much more authentic than a kind of make-believe artificial endings of Indian theatre. So he said that, Shish Kumar Das mentions it in his wonderful book, Indian Ode to the West Wind. Could there be a better name? Indian ode. But is this ode truncated in this moment of crisis all over the world? This beautiful book called of conversation on books. I think you may have read it already, Dr. Kidwai and others. It's called by a conversation between, very important conversation, between Jean-Claude Carrière, the author of the scenario of the Mahabharata of Peterborough, and the screenplay writer of Bunu. And it's not easy because in my house, it's all cluttered everywhere. I sleep on books and my wife is not happy. But what can you do about it? You can't survive without books. And the book is translated into English as, this is not the end of the book. And there, like in Pascal's Passé in the 1660s, like in Wasteland, he asks the same question. What shall we do now? What shall we do in this period of media invasion? Where is the time for introspection? Let's not believe that the new people always read classics. Everybody is not Ashwini Kumar or Dr. Manavali or Shafiq Kidwai or Shayantan Dasgupta or people here, important poets and writers. In the Dictionary of Stupidity written by Flaubert in the 19th century, there are dictionary entries like in a dictionary, and alphabetically it's done. And when he comes to the word classics, he writes, tout le monde a lu. Everybody has read classics, but nobody has. Everybody pretends to know classics, but nobody has. And that's problem is there. And he raised this question of what is a classic, a question, the title of a paper of T.S. Eliot. What is a classic? I didn't want to go into that. That will, because create more food for thought. It's a different kind of discussion. What is a classic? For me, something is a classic, which may not be a classic for others. I'm not talking about Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, etc. We all know people are recharged. Tolstoy was behind Gandhi. Romain Rolland is Jean-Christophe did reverberate in Tagore. And when they finally met, remember, people were saying that Indian works were not translated earlier on, they were. And the project of Romain Rolland about World Library, Weltbibliothek, wanted to begin with, not with Tolstoy, not with contemporary great writers like Marcel Proust or Gide, but with Rabindranath Gora. The beginning of realization that when you grow up, you realize that you are a world citizen. So that is very important. That was the beginning of an alternative paradigm that the outside world can create in us. And I told you, André Gide said very correctly, they do not influence us, create us. The influence doesn't create anything, it awakens. Literature can not be taught, perhaps. It awakens a lump in the mind. Very important. And what is important also, there are many other aspects which we couldn't discuss. There are problems everywhere, problems of translation, lack of language, knowledge of language. And so this question of affinities, diversities, ambivalence, and appropriations have to be analyzed in greater detail. But what is important is that this moment of joint discussion was extremely important at this moment of time in history. Because now we should think and ponder where to go. Do we reconstruct the discourse? This moment of neurosis in the society and cracks and crevices in the social fabric are very, very threatening for us as human beings. What do we really do? Do we sort of recreate the classic, like in the case of Vishal Bharadwaj films, or assimilate it like Tagore? As very interesting, different ways of looking at the same classic. As you know, Borges and I think the other writer, I just forgot, very important writer, they rejected Tagore in Argentina. Cesare Vallejo and Jose Luis Borges rejected Tagore, while Pablo Neruda and Gabriela Mistral thought that Tagore hailed from a country which could transform knowledge into a spiritual experience. You can't find influences on the surface of Tagore. It's all internalized. And that's what we want. We must convert everything into fresh blood. That's what Ashwini and others are doing, converting the borrowings and the convergences into fresh blood. That's very important at this point of time in history. And therefore, this is not the end of the book. This is the beginning, perhaps, of a reappraisal of the relation between self and the other. We need this introspection. So the book, our quest in the books from the world continues. The fight goes on. Thank you very much. You can understand the anxiety of at least some of us. We have to rush to the airport. Yeah. That's right. That's right. That's right. So thank you very much. And I think they said things very clearly, and I completely trust you. You could understand what they said. They were crystal clear, but we could really present something meaningful. They could all present something meaningful, and it enlivened the discussion. Thank you. I thank my panel and the audience.
Well, thank you, panelists, for this intriguing, interesting, and thought-provoking session. We'll meet again at 12:30 for our next session, discussion on fantasy and science fiction in India.